Buongiorno, hola, bula, ni hao, aloha, good morning. Welcome to the City Infrastructure Committee meeting of the 15th of February 2022. I'd like to begin today's meeting by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we are gathered and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to advise attendees in the room that this meeting is being webcasted and audio recorded, and I remind attendees to practice social distancing and take necessary safety precautions. Do we have any leave of absences to declare? I note that the Mayor is out of the room at the moment, but he will be returning. There being no other and everyone present, thank you very much. What have we got? Item 4.1 for reports today. I now refer to item 4.1. Can the Road and Infrastructure Planning Manager, Mr. Kamal Ranawira, please enter the discussions? But before we open the discussions, do any councillors have any conflicts of interest to declare? There being none, thank you very much. I now refer to Mr. Ranawira to open public discussion. You may proceed.
Thank you. This report and the next one is all about flood studies. And with this report, we are trying to set up a process for flood studies. We are seeking an endorsement for a couple of things. One is to approve a flood studies program, which is in the report. The second is to approve, get an endorsement on the two-stage process. First stage is acceptance process and the implementation process. I'll explain it a little bit more as we go on. The reason for flood study review is outlined in 3 documents, and the 3 documents are mentioned in the report as well. State planning policy outlines that we need to incorporate flood studies with climate change. Australian rainfall and runoff is the guide for flood estimation. The Queensland Flood Commission of Inquiry says set up with various recommendations at the end after the 2011 flood. In summary, all these 3 documents mention 2 things. One, the importance of having a recent and appropriate flood study or flood information available for floodplain management. Second, the importance of sharing those studies outcomes appropriately. So all 3 documents talk about those things. The state planning policy, if I may talk to a little bit about that, it's about the risk associated with natural hazards, including projected impact on climate change. It supports the recommendations of the Flood Commission inquiry as well. Australian rainfall and runoff actually provides the methodology and the information for flood modeling. It is the industry guide for flood mapping. It is a Bible for flood modeling for the professionals. Now, ARR, or Australian Rainfall and Runoff, recently did some significant revisions. In 2019, it incorporated 30 years worth of data. It actually outlined a different methodology. He improved the methodology, in other words. This means all of our flood studies now need to be revised to comply with that. Queensland Flood Commission of Inquiry made a raft of recommendations, and I think we have outlined some of the briefly what they are in the report. The Commission outlines a strong recommendation of local government to consider having flood risk information map and share that information with the community as soon as practicable following acceptance of flood study. So that's what we are talking today. So in order to comply with these requirements, the report proposes a program of flood studies and revisions, flood study revisions to be done. I think it is in page 9. Secondly, the report outlines 2-stage flood study acceptance and implementation process. Why 2-stage? Once the flood study is completed, it takes a while to get that flood study into the planning scheme, and which is the legal mechanism of planning instrument for us to endorse flood studies. So, but that gap between completion and endorsing into the planning scheme is usually about 1 year or more than that even. So in order to avoid that delay, we need this two-stage process. Stage one is engaging a consultant or engaging an expert professional engineer in developing flood models. That's the first thing, commissioning of a consultant. And then there could be instances where it is really, really complex. The area is big. We probably need to appoint a peer reviewer as well to review the consultant's work. So at the end, consultant and the peer reviewer has to agree on certain their issues and come up with the agreed position saying that this is the flood study that is fit for purpose. So that was certified under the Act of Professional Engineers Act, RPQ has to certify that. So once RPQ has certified that, that means it is fit for purpose to use, in other words. So at that point, we will engage the councillors, come back to the councillors and say, especially the area councillors where the flood model is done, and explain, give the statistics of the impacts, and also happy to come and talk to the councillors in person as well. And there could be issues, very localized issues that we may have to fine-tune, but very unlikely because most of the LiDAR data that we get on topography are quite good at these days, but we are happy to look into those kind of things. The impacts of those flood studies are the ones that everyone's concerned. We need to look at strategies to mitigate those impacts as well. That's not in this report. The second stage is from there onwards to put that, the last bit that I need to include is once the councillor consultation completed, we will issue a memo to internal branches saying this flood study is now complete, it is fit for purpose, can share with people or the infrastructure providers. So that memo will go to the internal branches saying, and also that flood study can be endorsed into the next planning scheme amendment or planning scheme. So stage two, or the second stage of the process, is putting that into the planning scheme. That is controlled by the planning scheme statutory process managed by ED&S. The steps to be undertaken are prescribed in ministers' guidelines and rules. And I think one of the key things that I highlight is there will be a process where we need to engage stakeholders and community consultation. So that's the process outlined. So we are asking for two things. One is to endorse the program, and the second one is to endorse the process. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've got a list of councillors: Heremiah, Hall, Karansky, Stemp and Bradley. Councillor Heremiah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions, so if you would indulge me, that'd be appreciated. Mr. Manager, you talked about how there will be impacts of this proposal. Now, those impacts will be on the community. So I wanted to ask, what community consultation has been actioned in preparation of this report?
We are reviewing the previous flood studies. That's what we are doing, because we asked, the legislation says we have to review that. I have mentioned 3 documents, and all those 3 documents says that there is a need for us to review that now. So that's what we are doing. And community consultation, we go to the community consultation once we know the impacts. At the moment, we don't know exactly the impacts. So once we do the flood modeling and finalize the modeling, we will know the impacts.
And these documents you've mentioned, and I appreciate that answer, but these documents that you've mentioned, they come across our desks, they're on our computers, but in reality, they cause real pain for a lot of people. Now, I've heard a story a number of years ago that Moreton Bay Regional Council also was looking at different flood maps and had, not the exact, but had a similar sort of discussion. And what happened is that thousands of property owners in Moreton Bay Regional Council were affected by changes from council. And these weren't property owners from the big end of town. These weren't the Mirvacs and the land leases. These were normal, everyday people. And they tended to be retirees who don't have a full working life of superannuation, and they rely on their property and selling their property to retire in a healthy and happy way. Now, I'm concerned that we haven't taken the community on this journey. And when I look at our river, Moreton Bay has a bay, Logan City has a river. And that presents a similar sort of risk. And I don't see any of those strategies that you've mentioned to mitigate the risk of impacting these people's lives. I don't see any lessons learned logs from similar councils and how we can make sure the same thing that happened in Moreton Bay doesn't happen to us. You've stated that, quote, we need to look at strategies to mitigate the impacts, but that's not a part of this report. I see it as a part of this report. I see it as a part of this scope. If we go down this route, we need to understand the impacts that it will have on people, and we need to make sure that those people are brought along the journey from the very start. There's thousands of property owners, and in places like Logan Reserve and Bar Scrubs, there will be a lot of people hurt by this sort of thinking. So my proposal is that in regards to item 4.1 and 4.2, that we defer these reports until a further time that the community has been adequately consulted by council, because this is serious stuff and it's going to hurt a lot of people if we don't do it right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks very much. Mr. Ranawira, have you got a response? Or Mr. Director?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In regards to report 4.1 and in regards to your comments, and I certainly acknowledge that flooding is an item which is obviously of importance to a lot of our residents, certainly where we see rain impacts and those impacts, they have impacts upon their properties, which can have impacts on property values as well. Report 4.1 actually is in advance of those flood studies, so 4.1 isn't actually talking to the outcomes of those flood studies. We certainly don't have impacted properties attached to this report. The report is talking to the process by which council actually undertakes the studies, so saying that we actually have a program of work in front of us so that council can actually see what studies are going to be undertaken in the future, to meet with council's obligations in regards to state requirements in the Planning Act and in regards to our obligations following from the inquiry which was undertaken post the 2011 Brisbane floods. The aspects which you're talking to in regards to whether council can mitigate those, the engagement that we need to do with the community, they would be pieces of work and will be large pieces of work that we will need to do when we've actually had those flood studies and we can actually identify what those impacts are. We're premature at this point in time. We're really at that beginning stage where we're saying we have reports which are in process being completed. Some are well progressed already, but with some further work to do, so we don't know the impact. Others are still at the commencement stage. But it's to give council some, I guess, vision on what that is and how that works. The real piece in regards to this report is actually trying to make that information available to our community earlier. So at the end of the 2011 floods, when they did the Royal Commission into the flood inquiry, what came out of that was a position that there was reports that were sitting with the council, with Brisbane City Council, which had not at that stage been adopted into their planning scheme. So that planning scheme process can take anywhere from 12 months to 2 years to actually see that happen. So they were fairly critical on the fact that council actually had information which it had not made available to its community, where the community could have assessed their own risk better in preparation for that event. So the report's actually talking to that process, saying when we actually have that information available, that we will actually make that transparent to the community. And I acknowledge that that has strengths and weaknesses. There will be people that will be impacted in regards to their current properties, but there will be people who may not realise that they have a risk in regards to flooding, etc. And for them to actually be aware that they do need to prepare and be across that from a disaster management point of view as well.
Thanks very much, Director. Councillor Jeremiah has indicated that he'd like to defer 4.1 and 4.2. We'll test that at the end before we look at the motion. Do you have another question, Councillor Jeremiah?
Just taking on board the Director's expertise and advice on that, that makes complete sense, and I'm happy to compromise, and I think the best way to do this is I'll change my intention from deferring 4.1 and 4.2 and limit it, compromise, and just have an intent to defer 4.2.
Thanks. Do you have any further questions, Councillor Herrimeyer? Okay, moving on. Councillor Hall?
I'll start with a bit of humour. Does anyone want me to explain flooding? The rain comes... No? Okay. Look, flooding itself is an act of God, or, you know, if you're an atheist, an act of nature. It has been proven time and time again, no matter how much research you do, you cannot predict the effects of flooding. Now, if I was to be sensitive to climate issues, I could say that all of Australia is a flooding risk. Okay, and everything we do will affect that. There is never going to be super accurate flooding maps, because if I was a developer, I could do a simple route around my property and I could flood the whole street. So I'm unsure why we would spend so much money to investigate these issues when there are so many little things, minute things, which should just make them naught. I think all we're doing is making insurance more expensive for our residents, which is not what we should be doing. We should be supporting our residents and protecting their investments. Thank you.
I don't know that you want a response to that, do you, Councillor Hall? No, thank you. Councillor Stem?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My two questions were, how often are flood studies required to be revised to ensure they're current? Is it a 10-year time? Is there a time frame, please?
I think it's more driven by the changes, what's happening in the place, topography, the concentration of channels because of the developments, or putting more roofs and restricting the imperviousness of the ground. So all of those things. If I want to give you a time limit, probably a 10 years time probably is good enough. You need to review the flood maps. But if it is in a rural area, nothing happens, floods remains the same. So nothing has happened there. So it depends, yes.
And so one of the main reasons we're doing this is in preparation for the Logan Plan. Is that correct? The amendment to the Logan Plan?
Yes, that's one of the things, but as well as we have an obligation to the residents to inform the risk of flooding. So that's the main reason. That's the biggest risk that we have. I know that it will impact the residents, but at the same time, if you don't tell them there is a flood risk and proper flood mapping is done with some sort of science behind it, and we have to accept that because that's the science now. Mm-hmm. And we do that flood mapping and then inform the residents there is a risk of flooding. That's the main reason we are doing that. And informing that is more important than looking after the impacts as well. We need to look after the impacts. I'm not suggesting walk away from that, but yes, we need to inform the residents.
So it's been, say, 10 years since we've looked at this? Or how long ago? Remind me how long ago since we did this?
We did the planning scheme flood overlay in 2015 or 14, somewhere around that.
Okay, so it was in preparation for the planning scheme last time.
Yeah.
Okay, but this isn't funded through the planning scheme funding? This is a separate project as such?
There is some funding from the planning scheme. There is some funding from the planning scheme, but as well as the normal consultancy budget as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Bradley?
Thank you, through the chair. There's been a number of comments made already, and I just want to give you my perspective of what has happened historically. Yes, in 2011 there was a report that council then had to go and investigate the flooding. That actually did create a lot of angst in the community, because here we are being transparent. A lot of people were like, oh, well, it's never flooded in my area, but it does actually impact residents in terms of their insurance. So it did create, even in the area I represent, a lot of angst. So I think my personal belief on this, I feel we owe it to our community to be transparent about what the risk is for them and for their own property. And you've got to evaluate it according to climate change, because the sea level supposedly is going to change. So I'm wholeheartedly in support of this, being transparent to our community about the potential risks going forward.
Did you want a response to that, Councillor Bradley, at all? Or?
Not really, just
Okay.
expressing myself.
Thank you. Mr Mayor?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I was a divisional councillor who had a lot of flood studies done, and a lot of residents were affected, and it was not a great experience. But at the same time, we have a responsibility, and you've got to remember that there will be new people coming into the city, and if we don't analyse our flood risks, they will be potentially buying flood-affected properties. And if we don't fulfil our obligations as a councillor, then I would consider that we would be at risk, potentially legally. I'm looking at, what happened with the flooding of, with Sunwater being sued and so forth. The potential could be that if the council hasn't taken the utmost care and diligence in bringing the flood studies up to a level that would be expected by the community of a delegated authority like the council, then I would imagine they would have the ability to sue council. And that would potentially be damaging in so many ways. And I don't believe we've got a choice, really. I think the obligations are pretty consistent with what's to be seen as a responsibility of council. So I'll leave it at that, but that's my opinion, and like I said, I'm not going to sugarcoat it.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. We've got Councillor Raven, Councillor Hall, Councillor Bradley, Councillor Bannon, and then myself.
I'm happy to move it so that was all I was going to raise.
Thanks very much, Councillor Bradley. Councillor Raven?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, in 2012, my electorate was heavily impacted by the state government decision to change the flood level from Q50 to Q100. That was a massive impact. It effectively doubled the floodplain. That took millions of dollars out of the pockets of residents. And if you speak to those residents today, they're still angry about it. And if you ask them if their property is ever flooded, they say no. If you ask them if they're 100 years old, they also say no. So whether or not you believe your property will flood, whether or not you believe you'll get skin cancer from getting sunburn, whether or not you believe that smoking is bad for you and leads to many causes of cancer, we have a lot of evidence that points towards these things. And as a government, we can't sit there and say, I'm going to put my head in the sand because it might cost someone some money. Because what it ends up costing people, if you try to save them money, is their lives. So we've had flood where houses got washed away near Tygum Lagoon. We had to buy those properties off the owners because you can never let someone build there again when high-speed water goes through a property. And if they didn't get out of that house in time, their life is at risk. And people do silly things in floodwater, and that's on them. But when it comes to this council, we have an obligation to our community to keep them safe. More than that, you have an obligation to consider the downstream impacts. So if my house is near the edge of a floodplain, which it is, and I want to develop it, which I can, but over time, other development, changes in climate, more severe weather events, whatever you want to call it, has meant that I've moved into the floodplain, and I don't know that, and I do earthworks, I build extra structures, then all of a sudden my neighbours who were on dry land, I've just made them flooded as well, because this council didn't take its responsibility seriously and didn't consider all of the consequences of not having accurate flood mapping. Now, I personally think with how fast we've been growing, 2014 being the last time we did the flood map 8 years ago, it's probably too long to leave it, because we've had so much development, major earthworks, PDA development, to say that there's been no impact whatsoever on the rivers. And if you talk to residents, they are quite convinced anecdotally that all that extra development means that the river floods faster and harder, and that their property that used to get a little bit flooded gets a lot more flooded. And those are the people directly next to the river. But those impacts expand further and further out. What I do know is that while more properties might enter the floodplain, it will never be as bad as it was when the state government changed it from Q50 to Q100. That was devastating to the retirees in my electorate. Thousands of properties that were previously dry, and they swear black and blue that their roads don't flood. I've seen their roads flood. I've stood there and I've filmed it, but they tell me their roads don't flood because when it's your property, you don't want it to be true that it floods and therefore it's worth less. So today, this first process is just making sure that the way that we do our flood mapping, the way that we bring that forward to make sure our community is informed and safe, is done prudently. And that's one of our responsibilities as councillors in a local government, especially in a government with two large rivers that are known to flood, often from heavy rain that happens upstream, far, far away from us. So things that we can't mitigate because they're outside our boundary can impact our residents. And we have to take that into consideration when we do this flood mapping. I actually think we should have done it sooner. And I'm worried that if we defer it, or we delay, or we wait, all we do is let more people build in the floodplain, not realising they're doing it, and that impacts more people downstream.
Thanks very much. Councillor Hall, you had another comment?
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Look, I'm just not confident in what we're going to do to put out accurate information in towards flooding, and risk goes.
It was an act of God.
Risk goes two ways, in that you can do all this work and you can say these areas are safe and these areas are unsafe, but what happens when the areas that you say are safe also flood? Is council also going to be accountable for that? We're talking about we're going to be accountable for places that we know will flood, but there will be places that we don't know will flood. Because we've got a continually changing landscape because of rapid development. But yet, we want to spend money to show an instance of, as it is now, as towards the way it is flooding. But that's going to change. And I will say, it will change much sooner than in 10 years. It changes continually. It changes every time a development goes in any area. I just don't feel comfortable and confident that council is going to do an accurate depiction of where the flooding will be. I think what we're doing is we're just setting up ourselves some more risk. And how far do we want to go on these things? Do we want to tell people where they can stand and where they can't stand to get sunburn as well? We're going to show that kind of risk? Like, how many different things is council going to get involved with here on residents? At the end of the day, I'm going to wrap this up. People do due diligence. Owners of properties will know their properties better than anyone sitting in this building. And it's a slap in the face when you just get dragged into a flood area because someone in a suit tells you that your property floods, when you know for a fact that it doesn't. And there's not much you can do when someone does that to you, and that's all.
Thanks very much. I believe the director wants to respond, and after that's happened, can I get councillors to test their audio equipment just to make sure each one is working?
Testing.
Justin.
Testing.
Tony. Testing. Yep.
Testing.
Hello.
Madam
Oh, yeah,
Chair.
one's working.
I appreciate the depth of feeling in regards to that matter, and I certainly appreciate the depth of feeling where we're talking about our community and things which will impact upon them. I guess I really do need to point out that there is an obligation upon council. It is legislated that we do actually have to do flood studies. We do need to include that in the planning scheme, and we do need to regulate development. We don't have an option not to choose that. There are well-defined processes which have been built up over, I guess, an engineering knowledge for more than 60 years in regards to Australian rainfall and runoff. The first version of that was printed in 1958, and effectively they've been revising that as we've been getting more and better data for the entirety of that period. I acknowledge that it won't be perfect in all locations either, but it will be the best modelling that we actually have and the best information we have in regards to that. When we go to put forward our next planning scheme, there is an obligation upon council to actually have a floodplain model in there. When we go to state interest check, they will look at that, they will look at the age of that. The modelling that we have, which allowed us to have the planning scheme in 2015, will not be sufficient for us to get a planning scheme across the line in 2025 if we don't actually go back and renew this modelling. That's just a fundamental requirement upon us to do that. We don't have an opportunity to walk away from that. If we do, we will end up with an unapproved planning scheme because we won't be able to provide the data that we've got. So there's not an option for us to choose not to do it. There's only the option of what we do. As Councillor Raven pointed out, 4.1 today really is about the process of just making sure that we do provide that information to the community, that we're going to use that information in the correct way. I will hold off on 4.2 until we get to 4.2. It's not about the actual studies, it's not the results of the studies, all of that is yet to come. This is really just putting in place a transparent process so that everybody knows when those studies come in, how we're going to do that, how we're going to disseminate that information, that we will engage the councillors in that process, that it's not going to slide past and you won't see those. It also gives some certainty to our planning colleagues as well, in that we actually have a process where they can then rely upon the fact that the flood study is complete and they know that they can progress that towards the planning scheme, which has been somewhat of an issue for us at the moment, that there's not a nice, neat cut that says it's in, it's correct, and we can now progress that towards the planning scheme. So it really is about actually creating that process flow and doing that in a structured way.
Thanks very much, Mr. Director. So we've got Councillors Bannon, Karansky, Harrimeyer, Wilcox, and then myself. Councillor Bannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you're right, state make us do this legislation, but state don't make us set a height, we set the height. So most councils are around 3.5, which is what we are. We want to go to 4.5. I believe somewhere there was a ridiculous idea of going near an 8.
Point of order, that's not this report. That's the next one.
All right, sorry. So go back to this. Just like I threw that in. And it was a great speech from Mr. Deputy Mayor, but I don't see how you can compare flooding to cancer. But it was great to get some momentum going. Most deaths and floods are from driving across flood water. That's a fact. Pretty much, I reckon 80% are driving their car across flood water. So and when it comes to being liable, the insurance companies don't use their flood mapping anyway. That's another fact. The insurance companies have their own flood mapping. It doesn't just change people's lives, it actually wrecks their lives. And I live on a river, have for 48 years. I'm downstream from Riverton, I'm downstream from Glenlogan, I'm downstream from Everleigh, not Everleigh, whatever the turf farm one is. Hasn't affected my river at all, it's gone down. 74 come just to my back fence, every other flood's dropped further, and I live on the river. Longer than anyone in this room lived on the river. I don't know how climate change affects the river. 4.5, to go to 4.5 affects 2,000 lots. So I don't think there's any discrepancy on being transparent, because I believe you're doing that, Kamal. Like, you're going to be transparent. But it's hard for me to vote for anything because I don't know the impact it's going to have on my community, especially when I live on the river. And there's a million stories. Division 5's got one which you didn't say, where his resident was worth $3.5 million, a block of land. We changed the flood map and it's worth 400 grand.
Point of order, state government changed the flood map.
Yeah, but state government never get blamed for it. Council get blamed for it. Make that clear. So if we're doing anything, we need to be really clear that this is a state government thing, because we get hammered for this flood mapping. I don't agree with it. There's a million reasons. I'm not going to take it up all day, but insurance companies have got their own flood mapping. Most of the deaths that you're going against are from driving through flood waters, and a lot of these properties just don't flood. They just don't.
Mr. Director.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We've probably progressed a long way into the next report, so most of the climate change elements are in the next report. So I guess I'd probably just draw back to, if we can focus on this one and get it out of the way. There certainly is some discussion to happen around climate change, and we can talk to that then. Yeah.
Excellent. So what we've got, Councillor Kransky, you still on the radar? Thank you very much. Councillor Bradley, did you? Yeah, we've got some people that haven't even made one comment yet, so I'll just.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I was elected, I had, it must have been around the time when we last looked at the mapping, and residents were aggrieved because they were telling me that they're old farmers, they've known the area inside out, they've never seen this level of water. So the questions like Councillor Harrimeyer and Councillor Bannon both raised, those issues, I was hearing a lot of that, and the mapping, they're saying that it changed their values for their properties, it impacted their ability to sell, retire and move on. And I had great sympathy for those residents, and I still have. So that is the concern of this, is that some people are going to be harmed by this process. But the flip side of it, and Councillor Bradley was good enough to come out to my community that was annihilated during Cyclone Debbie and Dornoch. And I had stories of residents who told me that their area had never flooded, it wasn't on the flood mapping, and they woke up in the night and they had water in their houses and they were terrified. And there were people at the end of their estate beeping car horns to wake residents up because they had no, I'm getting a bit upset, they had no consciousness that they needed to be alarmed because they hadn't been informed. So this is a challenging one because whichever way we go, it's going to have adverse impacts on residents. What I'm hearing from officers today, that this is actually our obligation more than our choice. And as much as it pains me, because I know some of those residents I'm talking about right now will be impacted by this study, and it will impact their ability to resell their properties. But I don't see that we have the choice, the luxury of the choice. So with a heavy heart, but knowledge is power. So, you know, and empowering, I agreed with what the Mayor was saying. When new people come into the area and they don't have this knowledge, then they inherit these problems that we haven't closed the loops on. So thank you for indulging me just to share my experience, Madam Chair.
It's a pretty heartbreaking one when you live through it, that's for sure. Councillor Harrimeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate the empathetic approach that Councillor Kransky is taking, but we need to remember that cyclones, and especially that cyclone that you've mentioned, is a 1 in a million event. This is about flooding. And when it comes to... Point
of order, it was a 1 in 35-year flood.
Excuse me, order, just a moment. Councillor Harrimeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When we look at this, taking an empathetic approach is the best way to go, because this is going to affect lots of people. It's a multi-generational effect. It's going to affect retirees that won't be able to sell their property for an appropriate amount of money. That's their main form of investment that they've saved, paying off their whole life. And instead of living a happy and healthy retirement, they will live one of a lower standard. But it won't only affect old people and our elderly, it's going to affect young people too. And as a young person, I can talk about housing affordability. By introducing such strict proposals like what's in front of us right now, we're going to add to the housing affordability crisis in our state by limiting supply. Economics is about supply and demand, and this will limit supply, this will increase prices, this will make it harder for people to get off the cycle of rent, and it's going to affect them as well. So this is going to affect young people, it's going to affect old people, and it's going to affect our city. And I really urge everyone that when you vote on this, this isn't a boring report. This isn't a paper chuck. This is a serious report that will hurt people. So I urge you to be empathetic in your vote today, to put yourself in the shoes of people who will be affected by it. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Harrimeyer. Councillor Wilcox?
Thanks. I'd have to agree with what Councillor Hall was saying before. We're affecting the lives of residents, some of them very unnecessarily because they've lived here 10, 15, 20 years. It's never flooded on their properties. And the officers don't go and speak to those residents. They put the overlays on top of them the residents don't know if they happen to read a letter that comes out to them. And Councillor Raven before said, yes, he was out there and yes, the roads flood, but did their homes flood? Well, you know, well, you didn't say that before, you only said the roads flooded. But if you buy on a river or a waterway, there's risks involved. You know those risks that are involved. I have residents in my area that live downstream and that sort of thing, and they've lived through the floods and that sort of thing. That's fair enough. They know that. They live on it. But I don't like the fact that we are trying to predict into the future what's going to happen with the weather. The bloody weatherman can't even get the weather right for tomorrow. So how are we supposed to predict something that's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years in the future? We can't predict that. And I think that we are going above and beyond predictions that we can make, because I'm not a scientist. I don't work in the weather department, and I don't think any of us do. None of us can predict the weather in the future. I don't like this. For me, it's making insurance more expensive for the resident. It's making the insurance companies richer. It's making places inaccessible for people to go and buy, because essentially it's classed as a floodplain when it's never flooded there. And if it is a floodplain, what the hell are we allowing developments to go in there for, and developers to go and build on a floodplain and then affect the waterway directly behind it? I think the whole thing is flawed and I don't like it.
Thanks very much, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Chair. Have we done 4.1? I thought we... No.
I don't even know.
No.
Mr Mayor, we are definitely on 4.1.
Well,
Would you like to direct your comments
Yeah,
to
well,
4.1?
you know, like I heard the director say, the acting director say, you know, that this was the process, and we get on to the next
To
one.
the
We
point,
have that
Mr Mayor,
argument.
to the point, as usual.
All right, so rather than go around the mulberry bush, we'll get on to the real one, which is the next one, okay? So I'm going to move 4.1 so we can...
Thank you so much, Mr Mayor. As the chair of this committee and a councillor, I would love to have my say, and I was being very polite and waiting my turn. So thank you for preempting that by moving the report already.
That's all right.
I've already
So
moved
just to be
it.
clear, flood mapping, let's see, East Brisbane, $1 million+. They didn't lose a cent as a result of flood mapping. Bulimba, let's go $1.6 million properties. Didn't lose a cent as a result of having, 3 feet of water coming through their yards and high velocity water coming through their yards. So flood mapping is not a dirty word, and you ask why we need it. We need it so that we don't build houses in floodplains. So this report actually seeks to do a basic report. 4.2 is the one that you want to have a crack at. It's the way in which this report is done and the questions that you ask, which is Councillor Jeremiah's question about community consultation is a decent one. What exactly are you asking the local community that should be included in the report, and how it impacts them? But the reality is, prices in Brisbane didn't go down as a result of floods. They actually went up. They actually went up. The stats, I was literally on Brisbane flood map while you all were talking. Understand. But at the end of the day, everyone's had their opinion. I'm allowed to have mine. That's the beauty of democracy. So we've got the Mayor who's moving this, and we've got Councillor Bradley who is seconding it.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes, Councillor Bradley. Thank you very much. Councillor Bradley has moved the motion. Mr Mayor, would you like to second the motion?
That's procedural, so we don't have to second.
Just in case, anyway, let's just stick with what I know. All those in favour, please raise your hands. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's carried. Now, those people that did not vote, Councillor Jeremiah.
Against.
Councillor Bannon.
Against.
Councillor Wilcox.
Against.
Most importantly, Councillor Hall.
Abstain, and I don't need to provide a reason.
Thank you very much. That's moved. So let's move on to 4.2, please. Mr Ranawira, can you proceed with the discussions?
Okay.
Councillor Fraser.
After it's spoken.
Oh, thank you.
We are talking about 4.2, I think. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I will start saying that state planning policy, which is a natural hazard and risk and resilience for flooding, specifies we need to incorporate climate change in our flood mapping. we need to include climate change in our flood mapping. That's what it says. So the purpose of this report is to seek Council's endorsement of the recommended representative concentration pathway, which is a mouthful. I'll call it RCP for Logan. RCPs represent a scale of climate change scenarios linking with the emission reduction strategies in place or predicted. The range is from optimistic outlook to a more conservative outlook. RCP scale is derived by the scientists from Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, IPCC that is, and CSIRO. So with giving reference to the global climate change policies and actions. I mentioned about Australian rainfall and runoff in the previous report. Then that report, that document actually is the guiding document for flood estimation, and we need to specify RCP for to act and guide us to do the flood modeling according to that guiding document. Right. So that's the reason we are here, to understand what we are going to propose. RCPs are outlined ranging from RCP 2.6 to RCP 8.5. RCP 2.6 represents a future scenario resulting from a very aggressive mitigation actions from global community. So everyone has to chip in and put reduce the emission, put actions to reduce the emissions. ARR disregard this scenario merely because that would not be the reality. That's the reason. On the other hand, RCP 8.5 is the other end of the spectrum. In fact, RCP 8.5 represents a milder and almost no mitigation type of strategy for emission reduction by the global community. So inaction, in other words, which also may not be the reality because there will be some actions, and we know that Paris Agreement is already signed. Which means we are left out with two RCP scenarios. That's RCP 4.5 or RCP 6. RCP 4.5 means a stronger mitigation strategy. RCP 6 means which is not stronger as RCP 4.5, in other words. We did then ask the question from our HW colleagues because they have the ownership of the Council's climate change policy. According to them, their view is adopting an RCP 4.4 is considered defendable and consistent with the Council's policy commitment to recognize current and emerging climate scenario modeling. So the other factor is neighbouring councils, what they have adopted. Brisbane City and Gold Coast have adopted RCP 4.5. There are the councils who has adopted 8.5, 8 point whatever the higher value as well. Is in the report. So we see council's endorsement for picking a climate change scenario, probably RCP 4.5 as suggested.
Thanks very much, and I'm going to cheat and take the first question. So, Mr. Renawira, who is doing the study? What are their qualifications? Have there been any negative impacts out of previous studies that they've done for any other councils? This report talks about all the things you're going to look at, but not who's actually undertaking it and what risk we are of looking at them as our prospective report writer.
In the report, we have done a bit of a sensitivity analysis about adopting various scenarios, probably the RCP 4.5 and RCP 6 and RCP 8 point something. And you can see some tables where the property impacts and water level impacts, flood level impacts. So that's a sensitivity analysis we did. I'm not sure whether I'm answering the question now. The other thing is the research done about the RCPs is not us. The research was done by some scientists and some organizations.
International panel.
Thanks, I'm
International
just going to hand it over to Mr Director for just a moment, Mr Ranawira.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if I understand the question correctly, it's when we've actually adopted the RCP for the climate change, who actually uses that information to then
Who's
create the
writing it?
reports for us? So effectively for each of the studies that we do, it'll be the engineering consulting firm that we use, which will be the RPEQ. So for the information that we adopt, they will then use that. So we go to various consulting firms. They are the bigger consulting firms in Queensland. And as Mr Ranawira has pointed out previously, we generally for those bigger studies, always go to a peer review. So when we've actually done the study, we effectively go to one of the opposition that tended against them, ask them to review that report and come back and actually provide us feedback on how well that's gone. And then we actually take the recommendations that come back from the peer review and make sure that they're actually resolved out of the base report. So there definitely is impartiality to make sure that we're actually using that. The format that's used with the information is a set arrangement. So the science which we use is the science which is put in place by Australian Rainfall and Runoff. It is the process which has been adopted by the state that we will actually use. So while there is that bigger piece of work to be done, it's not that the consulting engineers that we use are at liberty to go and make their own decisions in regards to how they analyse the data or the reports that they find and come back with. There is actually a set body of knowledge that they actually have to comply with to actually be able to say that they've actually met the standards that are required from the state to do that. So when they sign off as RPEQ, they're actually saying that they've actually done that work in accordance with those policies that are actually in place for the entirety of Australia in regards to how we do floodplain modelling and floodplain routing. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Councillor Fraser, followed by Mr Mayor, Councillor Raven, Councillor Jeremiah, Councillor Stemp and Councillor Bannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question is to whoever'd like to answer it, I guess. So there's a lot of people that are sceptical about the model, I suppose, how accurate it is, I guess, using layman's terms and things like that. So what probability is there that you will get the most accurate possible answers, I guess, with this flood modelling, I suppose, if that makes sense? So I know from the background I had, psychology, it's 95% is our, the benchmark, but maybe not for you guys. But I'm just wondering, just to help people to understand that this model is Mickey Mouse, it's really good, it works, and it's very accurate, and there should be more or less zero doubt in our mind that we're doing the right thing and that what is shown is going to be accurate, so people can't go back and say, hey, hang on, my land's never flooded, it won't for the next whatever amount of years, but this model should show that it probably will.
Mr Ranawira or
Yeah,
no?
I think you're asking the question about the flood modelling rather than the climate change modelling. Okay. The flood modelling is an exercise which is based on hydraulics and hydrology. So hydrology is the science where you look at the rainfall events and get an averages of that rainfall and try and map some averages of rainfall to put into a flood model. Okay. The hydraulics is the conveyance of water on the ground and into a creek and then to the river. So those two are combined is the flood map that we get at the end. So those are established sciences. Both of them are to some extent. Of course, there are some unexpected things, events that could happen, cyclones, all those things are averaged and modeled into a certain framework. That's what the ARR has done. That's why every professional goes back to the ARR and say, okay, what that book, Bible is going to say about this flood mapping. So everything is done according to that book. So whether it is right, it's a model. right? I have to say that. It is a model, so that model prediction is the only thing we got now, right? We have to have some basis. That's what we are trying to develop here. Once we develop a flood map according to that ARR, that's accepted. It's acceptable.
Thank you very much, Mr. Renner. Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. To the Director, I want to simplify this. The report itself is basically asking us where the line in the sand is in regards to the levelling of where that we think the flood level should be. And we're talking about an increase due to climate change. And the officers have suggested in here 4.5, RCP 4.5, which will affect, according to page 17, an extra 2,500 people on the existing levels. Okay, my question, so we can get this down track. First question is that correct, my assumption? Okay, second question is there legislation that points us to 4.5? Is that the base model? Or can the officers go back to the original? Or where are we with that? Is there a legislative requirement?
Okay, there's a legislative requirement that says we must include climate change. To that extent, we actually have 3 different levels that we can pick from. So there's the 4.5, there's RP6, and there's RP 8.5. 4.5 is the one that assumes that there will be less climate change. 8.5 assumes there will be more climate change. If you look at page 16, there's a very simple table there, and it talks about the projected change of temperature by the end of this century. It says at 4.5, there would be a 1.9 degree increase in temperature, and based on what CSIRO can see, that means a 10% increase in rainfall. If we go up, we're at 2.2, 12% for an RPC6. At 8.5, we're at 3.7 and 8.5. My real gut feel, if I can probably play that out, at this point in time, the 4.5 is slightly conservative. In other words, we need to do slightly better in regards to our mitigation of climate than the Paris Accord. So given that the Paris Accord's signed, that's a target for all of the countries who've actually signed to that. If we can do that, or a little bit better than that, hopefully, we will come in at 4.5. If the world does worse than that, then based on what we're seeing in that science space, we will end up in a more significant scenario than that at a 6 or an 8.5. Now, all of this is talking about where we will be at the end of this decade. This century. So we're talking 2090, 2100. We have a reasonable amount of period between now and then. We will start to see how much benefit we get from the signed Paris Agreement in regards to countries actually mitigating their impacts on climate. So the report is suggesting 4.5, which is the one which would be the smallest impact, assuming that the Paris Agreement actually achieves the outcomes that we want, and where we're at. We don't have a choice but to pick one of those 3, so we have to pick one. We can go more conservative and say we think that climate change might be bigger than that, but I am mindful that the Council has opportunities between now and 80 years in the future to come back and review this as well. So if in 10 years' time we're looking at what's happening globally and we're seeing climate change which is significantly more severe than what we'd anticipated, we would have the ability to revisit that. There will be more information available at that time. CSIRO will have done more studies. There will be more information flow through Australian rainfall and runoff.
Mr. Mayor?
So with that, and I'm glad you've captured that, Darryl, because, Mr. Director, because basically what the Director's flagging to you is you've got a choice between the 3 that are on there. Okay? That's the choice. And realistically, I would suggest that we take the middle ground, and that's the RCP 6, because it only affects another 500 properties. And I think we're better off taking the bad news now and putting in place and look like we are being responsible, because I don't believe, from what the director's saying, is we're going to achieve what they've set out in the French, what was it, the French Accord? Paris Accord, sorry. I don't believe that's anyone's expecting the world to come to that conclusion. And just because we might be carbon neutral in Logan, we've got places like China and all the other countries doing their worst. And Australia we aren't the leaders in this to say, you know, we're probably seen as one of the worst polluters in the world, to be honest. But my suggestion would be RCP 6. Let's open the debate.
Thanks very much, Mr Mayor, for summarising that. We have Councillor Raven next. Just in doing your comments, keep them short, sharp and succinct, and if we can have the responses exactly that way as well, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr Mayor. I'll be putting forward that we support 4.5. The reason being that humanity is very good at adapting and will adapt as the climate gets worse if they're not meeting their targets. And if humanity can't adapt, the council gets an opportunity to expand it later. To go further than what's needed now and what's defensible now means that, while yes, it's a bold, it's a courageous decision, I think there's plenty of opportunities to change this number later on. Like we get 8 years down the track and we see that actually you're right, all those international players you said were going to do a bad job did do a bad job, and we have made progress, and by all means we can tighten it up then, we can go further based on the evidence. But right now, we've got a whole bunch of countries signed up to the Paris Accord. We've got a whole bunch of councillors in this room using electric vehicles. We've got a carbon neutral council. There's other councils doing the same thing. And I think Australia is moving, and so is America with new leadership over there, who are some of the biggest polluters in the world. So I think 4.5 is moderate and prudent to start with, and we can change it later if things get worse.
Thanks for your feedback, Councillor Raven. Councillor Heremiah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm so tempted to talk about American politics with John right now, but I'm going to hold it off. Keep focused. Was that a strategy, John? So on that, I would love to have this debate, Madam Chair, but right now we have an 8-page report in front of us with 0 attachments, and climate change is one of the most complex challenges that we're facing, and an 8-page report is not enough. What I would love to see is more information. I'd love to see a map of affected areas. I'd love to see consultation. I'd love to see more information, because how can we vote on something when we don't understand its impacts and we haven't been provided what information on how it will affect our residents? Tim, you've said we're doing the right thing, and I love your intentions, and I believe your heart's there. But with an 8-page report, we don't know what that thing we are doing is. We need more information. I'm keen to have this debate, but we can't have a debate when we haven't been provided the evidence and the information for us to be arguing about. When it comes to climate change, we need to be taking action. I'm a supporter of action on climate change, but that action needs to be responsible, it needs to be feasible, and we need to understand it. This right now is not enough information to vote on something as important as this, and I will be moving a deferral on this item until an appropriate amount of information has been provided so we can have this debate.
Thanks. So just to clarify, you're wanting the report, to consider the report, which is the contents of this report that they're going to write, before you want to consider whether or not we move ahead with 4.2.
That was one confusing sentence, Madam Chair.
Well,
what I'm in support
we're
of...
proposing 4.2. You're wanting a report that has greater information that shows the projected flood mapping as a result of 4.56 or whatever, so that you can consider the report. But that's actually the report that they're proposing to write.
This report, Madam Chair, will affect 2,000 residents. An 8-page report with 0 attachments doesn't provide me with enough information to know that I'm practicing my due diligence. So what I would love is for the council officers to go back, gather more information, and come back to us in the future with more attachments, with more information. Thank you.
So I note that you're moving to defer the report. We'll consider that at the end. I'll just let a couple of people ask some questions. We've got Councillor Stemp, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is this to the Director. I guess So I've got this clear. We need to provide an RCP to enable the flood study process from the previous report, which we have to do legislatively. So I've got that right. The selection of the RCP is evidence-based, and coming up with that 4.5, we've taken into account Council's climate change strategy. Is that correct? And it's been noted that this 4.5 potentially, or through taking this into account, is the best decision without restricting future development opportunity or raising undue concern for the community. Is that correct? So therefore, we can't compare ourselves to other areas. We've got to focus on our area based on our climate change strategy, and based on the assessment that's been done, it's saying that this is the best decision without restricting future development or raising undue concern. Have I got that correct?
Yes, that's fairly succinct around that, and it comes down to that position around risk and how much risk this council wants to take in that climate space. The report as it's put forward is the one which will have the least impact on properties within Logan. The other two choices will see more properties impacted than the option that we've actually gone with, because it's saying there is a bigger climate change impact, and that therefore will see a greater rainfall intensity, so greater rainfall fall. To actually get to more detail around that, we would actually have to go and do the flood studies 3 times. Once for each of those, and the flood studies, each time we do one of them, we're probably looking at the better part of $500,000. It becomes very expensive to do options analysis around flood studies. We have tried within the report where we had information to give an indication as to what we thought the likely impacts are, and that's not across the whole of council. That is, I believe, only on the Albert and Logan flood study. So that hasn't gone to our creeks or any of those other water bodies either. It's only looking at what we can see in a really broad sensitivity analysis. Yeah.
So based on all this evidence, then you believe that 4.5 is the best decision? I mean, that's what we'll come back to today. Okay.
It is the RCP that was put forward. We certainly circulated this report very broad and wide. Hugh have ownership of our carbon neutral study, so our climate study. They were very supportive of 4.5 as well. Yeah.
Councillor Bannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm with Miriam asking questions. So 4.5, is that the minimum legally we can do?
To be in accordance with what's been put out by the state and what's been through Australian rainfall and runoff, yes, I think if we were to do anything else, we would run risk that when we actually take the planning scheme to the state for state interest check, that they would actually knock back our scheme.
Cool. So if you got flood mapping done at 4.5, and we can actually physically see the residents that are going to be affected and how much it's going to impact our divisions. No, I know you haven't done that. That's what it said. So once that's done, so once we vote on this, is this done? Or we can see that once you go ahead, you go to your map and you come back and we go, mate, this is out of control. Can we still stop it at that stage? I just find it, Mr. Director, I find it hard to vote for something when I still don't know how much it's going to affect the people that I represent.
It is a really good question, and it is a tough question I get for councillors, where there are things which will impact the community and the ability of council to actually change those or to materially change that outcome. So definitely the biggest portion of this is mandated by the state that we need to comply with. The pieces that we do are the things around when we do the flood studies, making sure that we actually use the most current methodologies in regards to that, the best methodologies we can use to get the most accurate outcomes. And that really came back to Councillor Fraser's question earlier around confidence with the modelling we do. We certainly make sure that we're using the most current rainfall data, we're using the most current methodologies for modelling. We're not trying to run modelling which is only half of the process. There are certainly cheaper things that we could do and get outcomes, but we're not in that space. We are actually making sure that the model that we bring back to council is the best model that's actually available based on the current technology, current science, and the current best information around rainfall. And it is why we end up in that space where we have to redo these. Yep.
I mean, this I didn't answer it. I trust a farmer over a scientist all day. If we say yes to this today, can we stop it if it comes back? And I just see the disgusting impacts, like 6 is, I don't know how you got 6, but the way that's going to affect my residents. If I vote yes to this today, can I stop it if it comes back and we see it and go, what? And it's a massive more impact than what we've been told. Because until you do the mapping, we don't know.
We don't. When it comes back, the only mechanism which we have to ask for a rework on the model is if we actually find or identify issues within the model that are actually incorrect.
Can I stop it or can't I?
We can't make decisions, and I don't believe council can make decisions that it just doesn't like the outcome. So the outcome from the Royal Commission into the 2011 floods was really quite concerned about the fact that they perceived that there was flooding information which was not very palatable and had not been released. And they made some fairly strong recommendations around that, which are included in the last report.
Yeah, I mean, I've got no issues with the transparency. I think you guys will do a good job of that. I still did, but you guys, unless you could, I couldn't pick it up. So if we give this the go ahead now, is it done? I can't stop it.
We have to come back to council, and we will talk to council about that. We will present the findings of the study. Council has to adopt it. It has to go into a planning scheme, so you can stop it. The bit that I would place with that is there's a risk if you do that. One is whether the state will adopt our planning scheme. If we seriously have reporting that says there is flooding and we choose not to take that on board. The other one would be what the Mayor spoke to previously, which is we have flood studies which are conducted in accordance with Australia's legislative requirements that shows impacted properties, and we choose to sit on that information and not release it, that actually creates a legal risk for council where somebody could effectively buy a property which is flood affected. We have a study that says it's flood affected and we didn't make that information available.
Yeah, so basically, if we pull the trigger on this today, we're committed to it.
We're not committed,
Otherwise, legally, we give
but there would be very significant risks for council. The same as if we don't actually make a decision, there are significant risks for council that we don't end up with a planning scheme in 2025.
So state government forced this upon us, and we get the blame for everything.
They certainly, out of, I guess, the previous history around flooding, have made it mandatory on local authorities to do flood studies to mitigate or to control development within their areas. And they've been very prescriptive about how we will do that, yes.
So they just chucked us a hand grenade.
I'm just going to intervene here. There was an incident of a gentleman on Macleay Island who received his insurance after all the flood maps were done after the big rains in 2011 and the floods. And he received a massive increase in his insurance bill. And he rang the insurance company and said, why have I got this increase? And they said, because under the state's and council's flood mapping, you'll actually go under in a flood. He said, I'm on Macleay Island. If I go under, the whole of Brisbane's gone. So with this flood mapping, do they pick it'll impact 25 or 50 or 100 metres off the creek or the river and just capture all of that? Or do they take into the account the terrain and the realities of it? I think is what you're trying to get.
Answer the question? Okay. Megan can answer. Yeah. I should introduce Megan. Megan is our program leader for
Thanks. So there's been a lot of conversation about the actual flood models themselves, and I'll keep this really brief, but yes, it's a very comprehensive process that we go to develop a flood model. It refers to terrain data, long records of statistical rainfall and river level data, and we spend a lot of effort in ensuring that the outputs from those flood models represent historic events to within sort of 0.3 of a metre. We try and get within that range. Having said that, it's all statistical. It's based on statistics. Our rainfall records are growing all the time. And so each time you add to those records, you change the statistics, which is why we have to come back and revisit it. Sorry, what was the next part of the question about the climate change? So
it wasn't climate change, it was actually just the terrain and the, does it take it into consideration? A good example is someone may live along the river, but they actually may live up on a hill that will never see flood.
Yeah, so absolutely. So it's all based on the aerial LiDAR survey, and so it should represent the actual physical processes that happen when you get rainfall on a catchment flows into the rivers and creeks.
So this report won't have a blanket blue section over 100 metres in.
So the climate change scenarios that we're talking about are applied as an increased intensity to the rainfall. So all it does is essentially scale up the rainfall that gets applied to the model, the same computational processes referencing that same LiDAR data.
Sorry, Megan, just to clarify, will the blue line in this report go in 100 metres each direction from a river and say that's flood area as a result of increased potential rainfall, or will it take into account the actual terrain?
Yes, so the models follow the terrain. Yes.
Councillor Bradley.
Yeah, follow the contours.
That's good because it was Councillor Bradley's turn, Mr Mayor. I'm running this meeting, it's okay.
Thank you through the chair. I believe the director actually answered my concerns when he said that the 4.5 was conservative and it can be reviewed down the track. I'm happy to move the motion move it as put.
I have two more speakers and then it will be noted that you are moving the motion. Councillor Karansky.
I'll keep it short and sharp, Madam Chair. I would just say that I understand why councillors have anxiety around making this decision. It's a hospital pass, really. It's a difficult one for us. But I take on board what the director said. Not making a decision is no better for us, so a decision needs to be made. So as I'm not a hydrologist, in the absence of deeper knowledge in this area, I can only base my decision today on the advice provided by council officers. I take on board Mr Mayor's comments about increasing the, the conservatism of our decision to, or was it 8 or 8? Sorry, the other direction, 6, sorry. I'm not there yet. I think, as the director said, we've got 80 years to recalibrate the model, so I'm happy to recalibrate the model a bit further down the track, and I'll be supporting the officer recommendations.
2 was just a hopeful number. I now have Mr Mayor, Councillor Hall, Councillor Herrimeyer and Councillor Bannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say a few things. Could you imagine if the councillors in the past had wanted to put their head in the sand and we didn't have flood maps? Could you imagine where we would be financially, engineering-wise, and how much that would cost us to rectify the problems? Okay, so I just want to make that statement. Also, in relation to Councillor Raven, who obviously debated for 4.5, and I understand he wants to keep the numbers for the deputy mayorship, so that's fine. But can I just say...
Point of order. Unfair, unreasonable.
Can I just say...
Mine's based on the best advice from officers.
That was a joke. Can I just say that what concerns me is that approach about fixing it later on. How many roads are we going to build in the next 8 years? How many bridges are we going to build? How many real estate developments are we going to build? If you take that conservative approach, how much is it financially going to cost this city to change it to the next level? Okay, so I believe we're too conservative. I believe it's only going to affect 500 properties. You're probably going to save this city a lot of money by making this decision now. Also, you've got to take into context, for every person that's got a property now that will be affected, there will be a lot of those properties turn over and someone else will inherit the problem. Are you being responsible to the new people that buy the new house? Are you being responsible? I can understand the engineers putting up 4.5 because there's obviously a political issue here and that councillors have to make that political decision. But are you making the best decision for the city? I'm putting it to you that I believe, through my experience, that 6 is the more appropriate level and it will pay off in the long run, and you won't have to make those changes, and the bigger the change you make later on, you'll work it out. Just think of it in all the next 8 years, what you might have to rebuild or change, what it's going to cost this city. And don't forget, for every person that's annoyed with the problem, there's going to be people who are going to buy those properties and inherit those problems, only to find out later on that you didn't make that good decision in the first place.
Thank you very much. The answer is there somewhere, and I'm sure that people are making their decisions based on emotion as well as other factors. And having been through those circumstances, I'm sure that they will be looking at the emotional impact as well as climate and other things. We have Councillor Hall, Councillor Heremiah, and then Councillor Bannon.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. There's different ways to put your head in the sand, okay? One way is to actually just go on blind faith and trust that the information you're getting is accurate, and that is actually putting your head in the sand because you're not questioning where it's from and what it's trying to do. Look, I'm gonna put this exactly the way I see it, and for me, I see it as this. We're basically being told by the state government to jump, and they've said you can jump 4.5, you can jump 6, or you can jump 8.5. And we're just blindly going to choose, all right, we'll jump 4.5.
Point of order, Madam Chair. No one is blindly choosing anything. It's based on evidence and research.
That's not provided.
Go and look at the ICCP report.
Okay, this is my turn to speak. Thank you.
Stop misleading the committee.
Now, you can raise the flood levels as high as you want. You know what? You know what the developer's going to do with the money? They'll just raise them higher and higher. You know what that does? It just makes it worse and worse for everyone else. And you can't say you haven't seen it happening. If you see these big lorries driving around with lots of earth on them, where do you think they're going? Where do you think they're going?
Sorry,
Point of order, Madam Chair. This isn't even relevant to anything anymore. He's making up stories about lorries. So.
Laurie, what are you up? No. Councillor Hall, can you...
Look, you can make fun of my argument, but the fact remains, the thing is, you're making it harder for people who can't afford this, and you're making it easier for the people who can, all right? And look, at the end of the day, we've been forced into making this decision, okay? But we're going to be made to look like the bad guys out of it. We might as well just point exactly who is making us make this decision. The state government's making us make this decision, and we're going to cop the brunt of it as councillors, as local representatives. Now, I was elected to represent the people who are alive now, not the people who are alive 90 years from now. The people who are alive now, the people who have properties now, the people who voted now. So my decision will be based on what they need, not what people 90 years from now who may not even hypothetically exist if we all go underwater. Because if we're going to do the right thing, we might as well just tell residents to go buy boats. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got Councillor Heremiah. Can you please keep it short, sharp and sweet?
Yes, Madam Chair. I'd like to comment on what the Mayor said earlier, and I respect the Mayor's experience and wisdom in this area, but you talked about being responsible to the city. And I agree with you, we need to be responsible to the city. But when we have house prices and land going for $2,000 a square metre in Rochdale South, going for $1,000 a square metre in Logan Reserve, we're creating a group of people, a group of young people that will never be able to get on the property ladder, that will for the rest of their life have the biggest expense in their household budget as sunk cost instead of investing in themselves. This is about housing supply. This is about being fair. If we believe in economic equity, this is a wrong choice. Council officers are here to provide honest, frank and fearless advice, and I respect that. And you've mentioned about comprehensive processes. and I've sat down and I've seen them, but I want to see more. I want to have more information to make this decision. Another comprehensive process is being an 80-year-old couple who spent 30 years paying off their mortgage and have a risk of having their properties devalued because of a council decision. Now, we cannot delegate decision-making of this calibre. We need to have the honest, frank and fearless advice. We can't just say an expert has told us it's appropriate, so we're going to back it. We need to understand why the expert says that. And in this report, we don't have that information. And Madam Chair, I intend to move that we defer this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bannon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if we pull the trigger on it, we're pretty much done, because then we're going to put ourselves legally in a position where if we don't share that information, we're in trouble. Is it, if Jacob defers or Councillor Hermai defers it and we go ahead with the mapping, because you're going to have to do the mapping anyway, whether you get it or not, can we go ahead with the mapping just so we can see the impacts? And the other question I've got, which is probably more of a planning question, I get you guys are tired. If the government told you to do something, you've gone for the lowest one, which I actually respect the fact you've gone for the lowest, not the mythical 6. If you do the planning stuff, you know how you see a map and it's got a blue map and straight away the real estate goes, can't sell it. When we do the mapping and you have a percentages like you do with roads now, where you got 1%, 2%, whatever, can you have it like, we'll say 5% FL flood level, and the next one says 20% flood level and 50% flood level. And in those different categories, you can do different things in. So these big cyclones that turn up once in a blue moon, we can say, okay, you're at 3% flood level there, or flood chance. Inside that category, yes, you can build a house with a flood-free access, with so and so. Just so it's not a blanket, I've got a blue line, I can't sell my property.
I think it's a good idea. I think
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So part of the broader Logan Plan 2025 process is to move to that risk-based approach where we actually understand the various levels of risk, and to do that we need to have the comprehensive modelling and mapping, and then within those different zones we consider what is appropriate use of that land rather than just that in and out mentality. So that's where we're moving, but part of that is we have to incorporate projections for climate change. With regards to those projections, that all comes from the IPCC climate science modelling, so we have made reference to it. We haven't explained it in there. We are not climate scientists. We have referred to those reports.
That changes a bit for me, because in a good way for you, to have that category to say, okay, yeah, Cyclone Debbie might turn up again, and this part's going to flood, but that's a 1 in 50 or something. So we're going to let you build your house, and so it's not a blanket, gets a bit of water and you're done. So if we're going to go to that modelling, which I probably should ask at the start and saved half of the hoorah, I think that's a really good thing. But I do look forward to continuing a bit of a slang and match with John Raven at lunchtime.
Okay, so we have Councillor Bradley who's moved a motion, but first we have to deal with the deferral. So Councillor Hermai has moved to defer item 4.2 pending further to a future committee, pending further information. He's moved that. Do I have a seconder for that motion? Councillor Hall. All those in favour, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's been lost. All those against? Do we have to state the reason why we're against? No, lost. Thank you very much. Raise your hands again for those who are opposed to them. So that would be Mr. Mayor, Division 1, Division 5, Division 3, Division 4, Division 7, Division 10, Division 12. Karansky, Russell, Bradley, and Fraser. And me. Wilcox, Bannon, Hermai and Hall were against. Were for it. Okay. So we now have a motion on the board relating to item 4.2. Do I have a mover for that motion, please? First of all, do we actually need to do it as 4.5, 6 or 8.5? Do we need to select? We do.
The recommendation, which is up already, is at 4.5.
The recommendation is at 4.5. Can I have a mover for 4.5, please? Councillor Bradley's moved at 4.5, seconded by Councillor Murphy, pardon me. I'm so sorry. All those in favour of the recommendation on the board at 4.5, please raise your hand. So that is carried with the exception of Councillor Hall. How did you vote?
Abstain.
Councillor Jeremiah, how did you vote?
Against.
Councillor Bannon, how did you vote? Councillor Wilcox, how did you vote?
Against.
Thank you very much. Councillor Hall.
I've had a change of heart. I'd like to be against.
Okay, no taunting in the committee. We're moving on to item 6.1, which, thank you very much, Mr. Ranawira, Ms. Gould. I really appreciate it. Mr. Ranawira, do you have any general business? Does anyone have any general business for Mr. Ranawira? None? Hang on, what's up? What's going on? Oh, 5.1. Councillor Jeremiah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've taken the liberty to read through the PowerPoint on my own time as it was attached to the agenda. So I'm keen to hear your advice on whether or not we can not have the PowerPoint just read out to us.
Are you asking that we just move that the report, that we've all viewed the report as we should do for our homework?
Yes.
Mr. Malouf, do you have any short comments that you would like to deliver as part of item 5.1, rather than rereading the report? Thank you very much. 1 minute would be great.
There you go.
Sorry, just before you start, does anyone have a conflict to declare for item 5.1? No one? Thank you, Mr. Malouf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This report was just a routine report in relation to where we're at with the capital delivery for the roads and drainage program. At the end of the December quarter, we are on track. We're slightly ahead from where we thought we'd be at the start of the financial year. The original financial year target was around about $105 million. We are on track to deliver that program. We do face a few problems. We are still grappling with some human resourcing issues. We are down at around 50% capacity, and despite that, we will still deliver a record program this financial year. Industry-wide, still materials are causing problems. We're trying to mitigate that where we can. But all in all, the delivery is on track.
Councillor Bradley? Can I just ask one quick statement? So how much did you say you've actually, how much work has been done?
To date, at the end of the quarter, I think the expenditure was, now I need the slides, around mid-45s. At the end of January, we're actually at about $54 million delivered on the $106 million. So we are still at the end of January maintaining that ahead of schedule. As an example, the entire delivery last year, I think, was 57, and we are basically at that point today.
That is fantastic. Can you please pass our sincere thanks along to all the crew there? Councillor Bradley has moved it. Councillor Murphy has seconded it. All those in favour of item 5.1, please raise your hands. Thank you. That's been carried unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Malouf. Thank you very much. Moving on, item 6.1, Logan Water Capital Works Program Performance Mid-Year Review 2021-22. I'll now refer to item 6.1. Can the Water Infrastructure Solutions Manager, Mr. Mark Vaughan, please enter discussions? But before we open discussions on this, do any councillors have a conflict to declare?
No conflict, Madam Chair, but a comment just before the start of the presentation.
Councillor Jeremiah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've also taken the liberty to read this as well, and would like to request if we can take the same approach to this report as the previous one.
You are a good man, Councillor Jeremiah, and I'm glad that you've done your homework. Have other councillors done their homework, and are they happy for this report to be succinct and short? Yes. Thank you very much. Mr. Vaughan, would you like to give a short statement around your report, please?
Yes, Madam Chair, I can go as short as you like. Very quickly, Logan Water started the year with a capital works budget of $139.9 million. We're currently forecasting that at the end of the year we'll be significantly less than that will be 114.6. There's good reasons for those variances as outlined in the report. Happy to take any questions if there are any on the reasons, or I can run through them, but I am assuming that being the time of day, I'll just go to questions.
I think if you've got a very short, sharp answer for the people at home who haven't read the report prior to this, and it can be done in a very short period, that would be
So
great.
the major swings in our capital works have been mostly related to the Logan Home Stage 8 project. That's our by far our largest project underway at the moment. That has the decrease in that was, if I just go to my report, decrease in that was a $7.8 million decrease for this financial year. That is really just a flow over into the following financial year because the project started a little bit later than we anticipated. There's been some related changes to that project with some of the infrastructure that links to it, with some of the pipelines that are reliant on that extra capacity at Logan Home. Some other changes of less significance to do with our renewals program in water, our new York Street offices and the fit out there. So yeah, it's been ups and downs across the program, but overall, all the projects are going to be delivered in line with our infrastructure agreements, and I don't think any of these changes will impact the community.
That's fantastic news. Do any councillors have any questions for Mr Vaughan? There being none, do I have a move for item 6.1? Councillor Stamp, seconded Councillor Bannon. All those in favour, please raise your hands. That has been carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay. Mr Vaughan, do you have any general business for councillors?
No, I don't, Councillor.
Councillors, do you have any general business for Mr Vaughan as the Water Infrastructure Manager? No. Okay. We've got, that marks the end of the Water Infrastructure Solutions Manager's report. I note that due to social distancing restrictions, not all managers or staff could attend today. That being said, does anyone have any general business for the Director or anyone else in the Water and Roads Infrastructure? There being none, thank you very much. That completes our agenda for today. I declare the City Infrastructure Committee meeting of 15 February 2022 concluded at 1:53 p.m. Thank you very much.